Major Friedrich Weber stood in the sweltering command tent outside Benghazi, Libya, in July 1941, staring at yet another supply report that made no sense. His hands trembled slightly, not from the desert heat that turned the canvas shelter into an oven, but from mounting dread that something impossible was happening in the vast emptiness behind German lines. 3 fuel depots destroyed in 2 weeks, 15 trucks missing. An entire ammunition dump near Jalo Oasis burned to ash. The reports claimed no Allied forces operated in that region, yet his Africa Corps was bleeding supplies like a wounded animal. Weber had fought in Poland and France, had seen mechanized warfare at its most efficient, but this war in North Africa was different, unnerving, like fighting ghosts that materialized from sand dunes only to vanish before dawn. His intelligence officer, a meticulous Austrian named Hauptmann Klaus Brenner, had just delivered the most disturbing news yet. A patrol that had gone missing 3 days earlier was found this morning, their vehicles intact but completely stripped of weapons, ammunition, water, and even their boots. The soldiers themselves were tied up 50 miles from where they'd been ambushed, alive but humiliated, left with a note in crude German that read simply, "Greetings from the Desert Scrubs." Weber asked Brenner what Desert Scrubs meant, and Brenner admitted he had no idea. But prisoners interrogated from earlier skirmishes mentioned Australian soldiers, though official intelligence insisted no Australian units operated this far behind lines. Weber felt something he hadn't experienced since the chaos of the Great War's final months, the sensation that his enemy understood something fundamental about warfare that he didn't, that all his mechanized superiority and tactical training meant nothing against an opponent who rewrote the rules entirely. By August 1941, German supply losses in the North African desert had reached crisis levels, with over 30% of materiel designated for Rommel's Africa Corps either destroyed or captured before reaching frontline units. This wasn't the work of conventional military forces. This was something else, something that exploited every psychological vulnerability in the German command structure, every cultural assumption about how wars should be fought, every technological limitation of tracking enemies across infinite desert wastes. The Germans had built a reputation for military precision, for mechanized warfare that overwhelmed enemies through superior coordination and firepower. But in the North African desert, a handful of Australian soldiers in modified trucks were dismantling that reputation one midnight raid at a time, and the psychological impact on German forces, on their morale, on their fundamental belief in their own invincibility, would prove as destructive as any conventional battle. What if I told you that the greatest weapon these Australian raiders possessed wasn't their trucks or their guns, but their cultural understanding of how to turn isolation into advantage, how to weaponize the desert itself, and how to wage psychological warfare that left German commanders questioning reality? This is the story of how men dismissed as colonial desert scrubs by Axis intelligence became the ghosts that haunted every German supply officer's nightmares, and how their raids weren't just tactical victories, but cultural and psychological warfare that exploited every weakness in the Nazi belief system. The Desert War had always been about logistics more than glory, and in that vast emptiness where supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of nothing, a small group of unconventional soldiers discovered they could wage a different kind of war entirely. The story begins not in the North African desert, but in the Australian outback during the 1930s, when the world was sliding toward another devastating war, and a particular type of Australian character was being forged in isolation and hardship. Ralph Alger Bagnold was born in England in 1896, served in the Great War, and became fascinated by deserts after being posted to Egypt in the 1920s. Bagnold wasn't a career soldier by temperament. He was an engineer, a scientist, someone who approached problems through observation and experimentation rather than military doctrine. During his time in Egypt, Bagnold began exploring the Libyan desert in his personal time, driving modified Ford Model A cars across terrain everyone insisted was impassable by vehicle. He kept meticulous notes on navigation using sun compasses he designed himself, on how to recover vehicles from soft sand, on water requirements and heat management. His 1935 book, Libyan Sands, detailed these expeditions and became required reading for anyone interested in desert travel. But Bagnold's real genius was recognizing that the desert's apparent emptiness was actually a tactical advantage for those who understood it. While conventional military thinking viewed deserts as barriers to be endured while moving between objectives, Bagnold saw them as highways for those with proper vehicles and navigation skills. By 1939, as war approached, Bagnold had developed theories about desert warfare that contradicted everything in standard military doctrine. He believed small mobile units operating hundreds of miles behind enemy lines could cause disproportionate damage by targeting supply lines, that the desert's vastness made detection nearly impossible if raiders moved at night and hid during day. That psychological impact of unpredictable raids would force enemies to divert massive resources to rear area security. British military establishment largely ignored these theories. They seemed fantastical, impractical, the dreams of an eccentric engineer rather than serious military strategy. But in June 1940, when Italy entered the war and threatened Egypt from Libya, suddenly Bagnold's ideas didn't seem so crazy anymore. Meanwhile, in Australia, a different cultural psychology was developing that would prove perfectly suited to Bagnold's unconventional warfare concepts. Australia in the 1930s was still defining its national identity, still emerging from British colonial shadow while developing its own distinct character. The Great Depression hit Australia hard, with unemployment reaching 30% by 1932. Young Australian men grew up in economic hardship, many working in the outback as stockmen, prospectors, or station hands. These jobs demanded self-reliance, adaptability, and ability to survive in harsh isolation with minimal resources. Australian culture valued pragmatism over formality, results over procedure, and had a deep skepticism of authority that bordered on reflexive irreverence. This cultural psychology, forged in outback isolation and economic hardship, created men who were perfect for unconventional warfare, even though they'd never conceived of themselves as soldiers. When war came in 1939, thousands of young Australians volunteered, not from nationalism exactly, but from a complex mix of adventure-seeking, economic necessity, and cultural expectation that when the Empire called, Australians answered. The Australian Imperial Force that deployed to North Africa in 1940 brought with them cultural attitudes that would both frustrate British commanders and prove devastatingly effective against Axis forces. Australian soldiers had little patience for rigid military hierarchy, called officers by first names, questioned orders that seemed stupid, and generally treated military formality with amused contempt. British officers often viewed Australians as undisciplined colonials, missing the point that this cultural informality masked deep competence and initiative. In July 1940, Major Ralph Bagnold, now recalled to military service at age 44, found himself in Cairo trying to convince skeptical British commanders to let him form a unit based on his desert theories. He faced enormous resistance. The military establishment viewed his ideas as wasteful fantasy. Why divert scarce resources to an experimental unit that wanted to drive trucks hundreds of miles into empty desert on vague hopes of finding enemy supply lines? Conventional wisdom held that the desert war would be fought along the coast, where both sides needed the coastal road for supply and water. Bagnold's proposal to operate deep in the interior seemed pointless. But Bagnold had one crucial advocate: General Archibald Wavell, Commander-in-Chief, Middle East Command. Wavell understood that Britain faced enormous disadvantages in North Africa. Italian forces vastly outnumbered British, and German reinforcements were likely coming. Britain needed force multipliers, needed ways to achieve disproportionate impact with minimal resources. Wavell gave Bagnold permission to form what would become the Long-Range Desert Group, with one condition: he had 6 weeks to prove the concept worked, or the unit would be disbanded. Bagnold needed volunteers who could handle extreme isolation, navigate by sun and stars, maintain vehicles under impossible conditions, and operate independently without supply for weeks. He needed men who wouldn't panic when surrounded by empty desert in all directions, who could think creatively when things went wrong, who were comfortable with uncertainty. British regular army soldiers, trained for conventional warfare with clear lines and supply chains, weren't suited to this role. But those rough Australian soldiers, those men who'd grown up in the outback and viewed authority with healthy skepticism, they were perfect. In August 1940, Bagnold began recruiting from Australian units stationed in Egypt. The pitch was unconventional. He didn't promise glory or medals. He promised hardship, danger, isolation, and the chance to wage war in a completely new way. He promised they'd be operating hundreds of miles from any support, that they'd be on their own in the desert for weeks at a time, that their survival would depend entirely on their own skills and their trucks. For a certain type of Australian soldier, this sounded far more appealing than conventional infantry warfare. Men like Corporal Ron Hill from Queensland volunteered immediately. Hill had worked as a station hand in the outback before the war, was comfortable with isolation and self-reliance, and found conventional army life suffocatingly bureaucratic. He later wrote that Bagnold's recruitment speech was the first time since enlisting that military service sounded interesting rather than tedious. Sergeant Jack Dennis from New South Wales, a former prospector who'd spent years in remote mining camps, volunteered because the desert held no terror for him, while military barracks felt like prison. These weren't men seeking traditional military glory. They were seeking adventure and autonomy, which Bagnold was offering in abundance. The cultural fit between Bagnold's vision and Australian temperament was remarkable. Bagnold valued initiative and adaptability over following orders precisely. He wanted soldiers who could think independently, solve problems creatively, and remain functional under extreme stress without officers micromanaging them. This described Australian cultural values perfectly. The early training and equipment development phase revealed both the promise and enormous challenges of desert raiding. Bagnold acquired 30 Chevrolet trucks and began modifying them for desert use. Standard military vehicles were completely unsuitable for soft sand. They needed special tires at low pressure, need-reinforced suspensions, needed extra fuel tanks and water storage, needed sun compasses and navigation equipment. The modifications were developed through trial and error, with Australian mechanics contributing practical insights that engineers missed. Private Tom Richards, a mechanic from Victoria, suggested mounting machine guns on swivels at the rear of trucks so they could fire while retreating, turning every escape into a fighting retreat. This simple innovation changed the tactical equation entirely. The early navigation trials were humbling. In September 1940, during a practice run to Siwa Oasis, one patrol got completely lost and had to be rescued by Bedouin traders who found them wandering in circles. The incident revealed that European navigational training was inadequate for featureless desert, where there were no landmarks, no roads, nothing but sand and rock in all directions. The psychological impact of being lost in the desert, of realizing you have no idea which direction leads to water and which to death, broke some men immediately. But it also sorted out who could handle the mental stress of desert operations. The men who didn't panic, who trusted their compasses and their training despite every instinct screaming they were lost, those were the ones who became the core of the unit. By October 1940, the long-range desert group was ready for its first operational mission, though ready is perhaps too strong a word. They had trucks that mostly worked, navigation skills that were improving, and a plan to raid Italian supply dumps near Morzuk, 600 miles south of the coast. This first raid would either prove Bagnold's concept or get everyone killed trying. The cultural and psychological dimensions of this moment deserve emphasis. These Australian volunteers were about to attempt something no one had tried before in modern warfare. Driving deep into enemy territory with no support, no possibility of reinforcement or rescue, trusting that their navigation skills and vehicle modifications would keep them alive. The psychological courage required wasn't the momentary bravery of charging a machine gun nest. It was the sustained courage of driving into vast emptiness, knowing that any mistake, any vehicle breakdown, any navigation error could mean slow death by thirst. This required a different kind of mental toughness, one that Australian outback experience had prepared them for, but that would still be tested to breaking point. The challenges facing the long-range desert group in late 1940 extended far beyond navigation and vehicle reliability. The skepticism from conventional military commanders was relentless and often bordered on sabotage. Staff officers in Cairo viewed Bagnold's unit as a wasteful distraction from the real war happening along the coast. They delayed supply requisitions, questioned every expenditure, and made clear they expected the unit to fail, so resources could be redirected to proper military operations. Lieutenant Colonel Guy Prendergast, Bagnold's second-in-command, later wrote that the administrative warfare in Cairo was almost as exhausting as the actual warfare in the desert. Every request for fuel, ammunition, or spare parts required extensive justification to staff officers, who viewed the entire desert raiding concept as an expensive joke. The psychological burden of operating under this institutional contempt, while simultaneously preparing for operations that could easily kill everyone involved, created tremendous stress. The technical challenges were equally daunting. Desert navigation in 1940 was primitive by later standards. They had sun compasses that worked reasonably well during daytime, but required constant adjustment for latitude and time. Night navigation relied on stars, but sandstorms could obscure stars for days. Dead reckoning using vehicle odometers was unreliable because sand conditions affected rolling resistance unpredictably. The margin for error was razor thin. A navigation error of just a few degrees, accumulated over hundreds of miles, could leave you dozens of miles from your intended destination with no landmarks to correct by. And in the desert, being 20 miles from water meant death. The human dimension of these challenges was captured in the diaries and letters of the men preparing for that first mission. Corporal Ron Hill wrote to his sister in Queensland, describing the surreal experience of training. He said they'd drive out into empty desert until they couldn't see anything but sand in all directions, then practice navigating back. He wrote that the first time, the psychological impact of being surrounded by absolute emptiness made him physically nauseated. His brain couldn't process the scale of the nothingness, but gradually he adapted. The desert became less threatening as they learned to read the subtle variations in terrain, the slight differences in sand coloration that indicated underlying rock, the wind patterns that shaped dunes. Hill wrote that he began to understand why Bagnold was obsessed with deserts. They looked empty but were actually full of information if you knew how to read it. The equipment failures during training were constant and sometimes deadly. Vehicles broke down regularly, usually from sand infiltrating every mechanical component, despite seals and filters. Radiators overheated. Tires shredded on sharp rocks hidden under sand. Fuel pumps clogged. Each failure required creative field repairs because they'd be hundreds of miles from any workshop during operations. Australian mechanics developed improvised solutions using wire, tape, and resourcefulness. Sergeant Jack Dennis became legendary for keeping vehicles running with repairs that violated every engineering principle, but somehow worked. His philosophy, very Australian in character, was that machinery that runs badly is infinitely better than machinery that doesn't run at all, so elegant engineering could wait until they weren't dying of thirst in the desert. The water challenge was perhaps most psychologically difficult. Human beings need roughly 1 gallon of water per day in desert heat, more if exerting heavily. A patrol of 40 men on a 2-week mission needed over 500 gallons of water, weighing over 2 tons, plus reserve for vehicle cooling. Every gallon of water was a gallon less of fuel or ammunition they could carry. The calculations were brutal and unforgiving. Run short of ammunition and you might escape a fight. Run short of water and you die slowly, miserably, inevitably. The men practiced water discipline obsessively, rationing themselves to tiny sips, learning to function while constantly thirsty, which created its own psychological stress. Thirst is primal, and fighting the urge to drink when water is right there in jerry cans requires constant willpower. The psychological preparation for isolation was handled informally but effectively. Bagnold understood that men operating independently for weeks needed to trust each other completely and remain functional without officers providing constant direction. He organized training patrols that lasted progressively longer, deliberately getting units lost and forcing them to navigate back without help. This built confidence and revealed which men couldn't handle the psychological pressure of isolation. Some soldiers, perfectly competent in conventional settings, fell apart when surrounded by empty desert for days. The unit quietly transferred these men back to regular units without stigma, recognizing that desert operations required specific psychological traits that not everyone possessed. The cultural bonding within the unit during training was remarkable and would prove critical to operational success. The Australian informality merged with Bagnol's scientific approach to create a unique culture. Officers and enlisted men addressed each other by first names. Decisions were often made through discussion rather than orders. Individual initiative was encouraged rather than punished. This egalitarian culture was both practical, since patrols couldn't function with rigid hierarchy, when every man needed to adapt independently, and very Australian, reflecting cultural values of mateship and collective endeavour. Private Bill Kennedy later described the training period as the first time in his army experience that he felt treated as a thinking human being rather than as a cog in a machine. He said officers would explain the reasoning behind plans, would solicit ideas from enlisted men, would admit when they didn't know something. This cultural approach built trust and initiative that conventional military training actively suppressed. The first operational mission launch in December 1940 was simultaneously exciting and terrifying. The target was Merzuk Fort, an Italian garrison 600 miles south of the coast, deep in the Libyan interior. The distance was staggering. For context, that's approximately the distance from London to Edinburgh. Except instead of roads and villages, there was nothing but sand, gravel, and occasional rock outcrops. The mission plan was audacious to the point of seeming suicidal. Drive 600 miles south, attack the fort, destroy supplies and aircraft, then drive 600 miles back before Italian forces could respond. The entire operation would take about 3 weeks, and they'd be completely on their own the entire time. No air support, no artillery support, no possibility of rescue if things went wrong. The psychological dimension of that departure moment was captured in numerous accounts. These men were driving off into vast emptiness with only their trucks, their navigation skills, and each other. Corporal Ron Hill later wrote that watching the last sight of civilization disappear behind them felt like sailing off the edge of the world. The silence of the desert was overwhelming. No birds, no insects, no wind sometimes, just absolute silence broken only by truck engines. For men raised in Australian bush that was never truly silent, the desert's soundlessness was psychologically unsettling. The navigation challenge became immediately apparent. They were using sun compasses and dead reckoning across terrain with no features. Bagnall had established a series of navigation waypoints based on his pre-war explorations, but finding these was like finding specific grains of sand on a beach. The psychological pressure on navigators was immense. Everyone's life depended on not making errors. Lieutenant Colonel Prendergast, navigating the lead vehicle, later admitted he barely slept during the entire mission because he was constantly recalculating their position, second-guessing every decision, terrified of making a mistake that would kill 40 men. 3 days into the mission, they encountered their first serious vehicle breakdown. One truck's transmission failed completely, probably from sand infiltration. This created an immediate crisis. They couldn't abandon the truck because they needed every vehicle for carrying supplies and personnel. They couldn't spend days repairing it because they'd run out of water before reaching Merzuk. Sergeant Jack Dennis and his mechanics worked through the night, partially disassembling the transmission, cleaning sand from every gear and bearing, reassembling it with fingers cut raw from metal edges, and exhaustion making them clumsy. By dawn, they'd made field repairs that probably wouldn't last 100 miles, but might last long enough to reach the target and return. This incident revealed the desert's unforgiving nature and the absolute necessity of mechanical improvisation. The psychological impact of equipment failure in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by hostile desert, created stress that only those who've experienced it can fully understand. On December 11, 1940, exactly 9 days after leaving their base, they reached Merzuk Fort. The sight shocked everyone. Italian forces had no defensive positions facing inland. All their defenses faced north toward the coast because they'd never imagined anyone would attack from the deep desert. The fort's garrison appeared completely unprepared for assault. Aircraft sat parked in neat rows without guards. Supply dumps were casually arranged with no protective berms or dispersal. The Italians' complete psychological unpreparedness for attack from the interior revealed a fundamental strategic blindness. They'd assumed the desert itself was defense enough, that no force could operate hundreds of miles from supply. This assumption, reasonable by conventional military logic, proved fatally wrong. The raid itself was almost anticlimactic. They struck just before dawn, destroying aircraft and supply dumps, then disappeared back into the desert before Italian forces could mount a coherent response. The material damage was significant, but the psychological impact was exponentially greater. Italian commanders suddenly realized their entire rear area was vulnerable, that the desert they'd assumed protected them was actually a highway for enemies they couldn't see or track. This psychological revelation forced the Italians to divert significant forces to rear area security, weakening their frontline strength. German intelligence reports from early 1941, after Germany began reinforcing Italian forces in North Africa, revealed the psychological impact of these raids on Axis command. One report noted that Italian morale in rear areas had collapsed because soldiers felt constantly vulnerable to attacks from nowhere. Defensive positions had to be manned throughout vast desert areas that had previously been ignored. Supply convoys required heavy escorts that slowed movement and consumed fuel. The report concluded that a few dozen enemy raiders were causing disproportionate disruption to logistics, but recommended against viewing this as a serious threat because the raiders couldn't possibly sustain such operations once German forces with superior intelligence and coordination arrived. This German dismissiveness would prove disastrously wrong. The period from January to June 1941 saw the long-range desert group expand operations and develop tactics while German forces arrived in North Africa and began experiencing the psychological warfare firsthand. General Erwin Rommel arrived in February 1941 to command the Afrika Corps with instructions to stabilize the situation and launch offensives to recapture lost territory. Rommel was Germany's most innovative armor commander, a tactical genius who understood mobile warfare better than almost anyone alive. But Rommel had never faced an enemy like the Desert Raiders, and his arrival would lead to some of the most psychologically devastating confrontations between conventional military brilliance and unconventional warfare. The German cultural approach to warfare emphasized careful planning, precise coordination, technological superiority, and overwhelming force at decisive points. This doctrine had proven devastatingly effective in Poland and France, but in the North African desert, where supply lines stretched hundreds of miles through empty terrain and where conventional tracking methods failed completely, German advantages evaporated. The Australians operating in the desert had no interest in fighting fairly or conventionally. They struck when vulnerable, disappeared when threatened, and turned the desert itself into a weapon. This cultural clash between German military professionalism and Australian pragmatic opportunism would define the Desert War's character. The first German encounter with desert raiders came in March 1941, when an Afrika Corps supply convoy escorted by armored cars was ambushed 50 miles south of the coastal road. The attack pattern was unlike anything Germans had experienced. The raiders appeared from behind a sand dune at dusk, fired intensely for perhaps 90 seconds, destroyed several trucks carrying ammunition and fuel, then vanished into gathering darkness before German forces could coordinate response. German armored cars pursued but found nothing. The raiders had disappeared as if they'd never existed. Lieutenant Hans Schmidt, commanding the convoy escort, filed a report describing the experience as surreal and psychologically unsettling. He wrote that his training had prepared him for conventional combat with clear front lines and identifiable enemies. But this was different. The enemy appeared from nowhere, struck with shocking violence, then became invisible. Schmidt wrote that he'd felt foolish pursuing ghosts into empty desert and returning with nothing to show but dead soldiers and burning trucks. The psychological impact on his men was visible. They'd gone from confident professional soldiers to nervous guards scanning empty horizons. German intelligence initially dismissed these raids as isolated incidents, the work of British reconnaissance units that would cease once Rommel launched his offensive. But the raids intensified. Throughout March and April 1941, supply losses mounted steadily. Fuel depots were destroyed, ammunition dumps blown up, vehicles captured or destroyed, and most psychologically damaging, water points were poisoned or destroyed, forcing German forces to rely on more vulnerable supply lines. The German response revealed cultural assumptions that the Australians exploited brilliantly. German commanders ordered heavier escorts for convoys, which slowed movement and consumed more fuel. They established defensive positions at supply points, which required diverting manpower from frontline units. They attempted to patrol vast desert areas, which was impossible with available forces and vehicles unsuited to soft sand. Every German response to the raids made their logistics situation worse rather than better, exactly as the raiders intended. The human stories from this period illustrate the psychological dimensions of the conflict. Corporal Ron Hill's patrol conducted a raid on a fuel depot near Agadabia in April 1941 that exemplified their methods. They observed the depot for 2 days from a concealed position several miles away, noting guard rotations, defensive positions, and supply schedules. German defenses were competent by conventional standards, with machine gun positions, searchlights, and regular patrols. But all the defenses faced outward toward the coast where attacks were expected. The inland approach, which required crossing 60 miles of difficult sand, was lightly guarded because Germans assumed no force would approach from that direction. Hill's patrol attacked at 2 a.m., the hour when human alertness is lowest, using the moon's angle to approach from the darkest direction. They destroyed thousands of gallons of fuel, killed several guards, and disappeared before the garrison could organize pursuit. Hill later wrote that the raid's success came not from superior weapons or tactics, but from understanding that humans have predictable vulnerabilities. Guards at 2 a.m. are tired, attention spans lag, reaction times slow. Attacking from the least expected direction, even if it requires harder approach, succeeds because human psychology struggles to defend against truly unexpected threats. The German response to this specific raid revealed their psychological state. They reinforced the depot with an entire company of infantry, installed more searchlights and listening posts, and established motorized patrols. All of this required fuel, which the depot was supposed to provide to frontline units. So the raid's success wasn't just the fuel destroyed, but the fuel consumed by defensive measures. And meanwhile, the raiders simply moved to a different target. By May 1941, German staff reports were expressing increasing frustration about the supply situation. Major Friedrich Weber, whom we met at the beginning, was assigned to investigate and propose solutions. Weber was methodical and intelligent, and his analysis was professionally competent. He correctly identified that the raids came from small mobile units operating from bases deep in the desert interior, that they used the desert's vastness to escape detection, and that conventional defensive measures were ineffective. He proposed 3 solutions: send mechanized patrols to locate and destroy the raiders' desert bases, use aircraft to scout and attack raiders, and improve intelligence gathering through interrogation of captured raiders. All 3 solutions were reasonable by conventional military logic. All 3 largely failed. German attempts to locate desert bases failed because the bases moved regularly and were positioned in areas German vehicles couldn't easily reach. Aircraft reconnaissance was hindered by the desert's vastness and lack of distinctive features. A patrol of trucks looks identical from altitude to geological formations, and captured raiders were rare because raiders who got trapped usually fought to death rather than surrender. Knowing capture meant revealing information under interrogation. The few who were captured revealed nothing useful, claiming to be isolated reconnaissance units rather than part of an organized campaign. The psychological dimension of interrogation deserves attention. German interrogators, trained in conventional intelligence gathering, struggled with Australian prisoners' cultural attitude. Australians treated interrogation with casual contempt, gave obviously false information delivered with straight faces, and generally behaved as if the entire process was an amusing game. This infuriated German intelligence officers, who expected military prisoners to show respect for authority. One interrogation report noted with frustration that a captured Australian sergeant insisted his unit navigated by following kangaroos who instinctively knew where water was. delivered this absurd claim with complete sincerity, and refused to break character despite hours of questioning. The interrogator concluded Australians were either genuinely simple-minded or deliberately mocking their captors, and either way represented a breakdown of proper military discipline. This cultural misunderstanding meant Germans never developed effective intelligence about desert raiding operations because they couldn't comprehend the psychological and cultural foundation of how these units operated. The technological dimension of German difficulties is important. German military technology in 1941 was generally superior to British equipment. German tanks were better, German aircraft were often superior, German communications equipment was more advanced. But none of this mattered in the desert raiding context. The technological sophistication that served Germans well in conventional warfare became liability in the desert. Their vehicles, designed for European roads, broke down regularly in sand. Their communication systems required infrastructure that didn't exist in the interior. Their intelligence gathering relied on conventional networks that couldn't penetrate the empty desert. Meanwhile, the Australians used simple, reliable trucks, basic navigation equipment, and communication methods that assumed no infrastructure. This technological simplicity, which would be weakness in conventional warfare, was advantage in desert operations. The human cost on both sides during this period deserves acknowledgement. German soldiers dying in rear area raids suffered particular psychological trauma because they'd expected to fight conventional battles, not be killed in supply areas by invisible enemies. The psychological impact on German morale of feeling vulnerable everywhere, of never knowing when attack might come, created pervasive stress that affected combat effectiveness. Conversely, the Australian raiders faced their own psychological challenges. The isolation, the constant physical discomfort of desert operations, the knowledge that capture meant potential torture and execution as irregulars rather than conventional prisoners, all created sustained stress. Several raiders developed what we now recognize as combat fatigue or PTSD, manifesting as inability to sleep, hypervigilance even when safe, and emotional numbness. The unit dealt with this informally through mateship and dark humor, the traditional Australian coping mechanisms, but the psychological cost was real. By June 1941, the desert raiding campaign had established patterns that would continue throughout the North African campaign. The Germans never solved the problem of defending vast rear areas against mobile raiders operating from hidden bases. They never developed effective intelligence about raiding operations. They never adapted their cultural and tactical approach to counter unconventional warfare effectively. This failure wasn't due to incompetence. German commanders and soldiers were professionally competent. The failure was cultural and psychological. German military culture couldn't adapt to warfare that violated all their assumptions about how wars should be fought, and the psychological impact of being continuously vulnerable in supposedly secure areas created a morale crisis that statistics alone don't capture. The climax of the desert raiding campaign came during the summer and fall of 1941, as Rommel's offensive stalled, partly due to supply problems caused by continuous raiding, while the psychological warfare against German forces reached peak effectiveness. The specific incidents from this period reveal how thoroughly the Australians had gotten inside German heads, creating paranoia and forcing defensive measures that weakened offensive capabilities. In July 1941, Rommel was preparing for a major offensive to capture Tobruk and push deeper into Egypt. His plans required enormous fuel and ammunition stockpiles because desert operations consumed supplies at rates that would shock military planners accustomed to European warfare. Every tank, every truck, every aircraft required fuel hauled hundreds of miles from ports. Ammunition expenditure was similarly enormous. The mathematics of desert warfare meant Rommel needed specific supply levels to sustain offensive operations, and he wasn't reaching those levels because raids were destroying or forcing diversion of roughly 30% of supplies intended for frontline units. The statistics alone don't convey the psychological impact. German frontline soldiers knew supply situations were precarious and knew the cause was raiders operating behind them. This created pervasive anxiety. Soldiers wondered if today's ammunition ration would be cut because some raider destroyed a depot last night. Tank crews wondered if fuel shortages would leave them immobilized under British artillery. Artillery batteries calculated how many shells they had versus how many they needed, and knew the math didn't work because supply convoys kept getting ambushed. This psychological burden, the knowledge that their offensive capability was being bled away by enemies they couldn't see or fight, created stress that affected combat effectiveness in ways difficult to quantify, but very real. A specific incident from August 1941 exemplifies the psychological warfare dimension. A German supply convoy carrying fuel to forward units was ambushed at night near Jarabub Oasis by what turned out to be a single truck with 4 raiders. The raiders used the classic hit-and-run tactic, approached from unexpected direction, fired intensely with machine guns and threw grenades, destroyed 3 fuel trucks, then disappeared into darkness. The German convoy commander, Hauptmann Ernst Kessler, responded by forming defensive perimeter and calling for reinforcements. A German mechanized battalion diverted from frontline positions spent 2 days searching for the raiders, found nothing, and returned. The incident's material cost was 3 trucks and their fuel. But the real cost was 2 days of battalion-level forces diverted, fuel consumed by reinforcements, psychological impact on every convoy learning about the ambush, and most significantly, the revelation that even heavy escort couldn't guarantee safety. Kessler filed a report noting that his men were now terrified of night driving through empty desert, knowing raiders could appear from any direction. This fear was precisely what the raiders wanted to create. The German attempts to strike back at raiding bases reached desperation by late summer. Luftwaffe aircraft conducted reconnaissance missions, trying to locate desert bases, occasionally bombing areas where raiders might be hiding. These bombing missions consumed aviation fuel needed for combat operations while achieving minimal results because hitting mobile forces in vast desert from altitude was nearly impossible. More significantly, the psychological impact flowed in the wrong direction. Every failed attempt to locate or destroy raiders reinforced in German minds that these enemies were phantoms, impossible to pin down, invisible and invulnerable. This psychological narrative, that desert raiders were somehow supernatural rather than just well adapted to terrain, spread through German ranks and created a mythology that amplified the raiders' actual capabilities. Corporal Ron Hill later recounted an incident that reveals the human dimensions of this psychological warfare. His patrol captured several German soldiers from a supply convoy in September 1941. During the brief period before releasing them, which raiders often did to free themselves from prisoner burden, Hill's group shared tea with the prisoners in a surreal moment of humanity amid war. One German soldier, speaking broken English, expressed something like admiration mixed with fear. He said Germans had been told they were fighting primitive colonial forces with inferior equipment and training. But these raids from nowhere suggested enemies who understood warfare better than German commanders did. The soldier asked Hill how they navigated across featureless desert, and Hill, engaging in psychological warfare even in casual conversation, claimed they used Aboriginal tracking skills passed down through thousands of years. This was complete fiction. Hill was from Queensland and had no Aboriginal heritage or training, but the German soldier accepted it as explanation for capabilities he couldn't otherwise comprehend, and when released, presumably shared this intelligence, which reinforced the raiders' mystique. The technological dimension evolved during this period as both sides adapted. Germans began using better navigation equipment, modified vehicles for desert use, and improved defensive tactics for convoys. But the fundamental technological limitation remained. You can't defend empty space, and the desert had too much empty space for available forces. The Australians adapted by becoming more selective about targets, focusing on high-value supplies like fuel and ammunition rather than routine convoys, and by improving their intelligence gathering through Bedouin informants who had no love for Axis forces and could move through desert areas without attracting attention. This intelligence network gave raiders advanced warning of German movements and locations of valuable targets, turning what had been opportunistic raiding into precisely targeted strikes. The human cost on the Australian side during this period was mounting but remained sustainable. Several raiders were killed in action, some from combat but others from vehicle accidents or getting lost in the desert. Each death was psychologically difficult for small units where everyone knew everyone. Private Tom Richards died in August when his truck rolled during night driving, crushing him. His death devastated his patrol not just from personal loss, but from the reminder of how fragile their survival was. They operated with no backup, no rescue if things went wrong. Richards' death also revealed the cultural bonds within the unit. Rather than evacuate his body immediately, which would require a truck leaving the mission, the patrol completed their raid, then drove Richards' body back for burial. This decision to prioritize mission completion while keeping a fallen comrade with them reflected the unit's culture of mission focus, balanced with mateship values. The psychological complexity of desert raiding operations is captured in the diaries of Lieutenant Colonel Prendergast, who had become increasingly responsible for operational planning. Prendergast wrote about the moral weight of sending men on missions that might kill them, the calculation of acceptable losses balanced against strategic value. He noted that successful raids created exponential psychological impact, but failed raids where men died without achieving objectives created demoralization that spread through the unit. Prendergast struggled with how to maintain aggressive operations while preserving morale and managing acceptable risk. His solution was to give patrol commanders maximum autonomy to abort missions if conditions seemed wrong, trusting their judgment rather than demanding rigid adherence to plans. This cultural approach of trusting experienced soldiers' instincts over hierarchical command proved effective because the men making life-or-death decisions were those who'd face the consequences. By October 1941, the cumulative impact of months of raiding had forced German High Command to completely rethink rear area security. An entire division's worth of forces were now committed to convoy escort and supply point defense, forces desperately needed at the front. Fuel consumption by defensive forces was eating into fuel available for offensive operations. Most psychologically damaging, German confidence in their logistical superiority had evaporated. Staff officers no longer made plans assuming supplies would arrive on schedule. Frontline commanders hoarded supplies when available because they couldn't rely on regular resupply. This defensive mentality, caused by psychological impact of continuous raiding, degraded German operational effectiveness more than material losses alone could explain. The German soldier's perspective from this period is illuminated by letters and diaries later recovered. Corporal Hermann Balk wrote to his family in October 1941, describing rear area service as more psychologically stressful than frontline combat. He wrote that frontline fighting was terrifying, but at least you could see the enemy and fight back. But convoy duty meant driving through empty desert, wondering if this would be the night raiders appeared from darkness. Balk wrote that men in his unit were chronically exhausted from hypervigilance, jumping at every sound, seeing threats in every shadow. He wrote that they'd started calling the raiders desert devils because they seemed supernatural, materializing from nowhere, striking with uncanny timing, then vanishing completely. This psychological framing, viewing raiders as almost supernatural rather than as human enemies using terrain effectively, reveals how thoroughly the psychological warfare had succeeded. The climactic confrontation between German attempts to hunt raiders and the raiders' ability to evade came in November 1941 during Operation Crusader, a major British offensive. German intelligence had finally located what they believed was a major raiding base near Jagbub Oasis. A mechanized force was sent to destroy it, representing the most serious German attempt yet to eliminate desert raiders. The force reached the supposed base location and found only abandoned campsites weeks old. The raiders had moved, as they always did, but the German force, now deep in the desert and low on fuel, found itself vulnerable when actual raiders observed them and launched attacks during their withdrawal. The hunters became hunted, and the psychological reversal was complete. The German unit limped back to their lines, having achieved nothing while suffering casualties and losing vehicles. The incident became symbolic of the futility of conventional forces, trying to defeat unconventional enemies in terrain that favored the unconventional approach. German staff reports from late 1941 show a command structure that had essentially given up on solving the raiding problem. Reports acknowledge the damage raiders were causing, but conclude that available solutions cost more than the raids themselves. One report noted that trying to hunt raiders was like trying to fight fog. You could wave your arms and occasionally hit something, but mostly you exhausted yourself fighting something that wasn't really there in the way you understood enemies to exist. This admission of defeat, though not called that explicitly, marked the end of serious German efforts to eliminate desert raiding operations. The psychological warfare had succeeded so completely that German command had essentially accepted continuous rear area vulnerability as unchangeable reality. The resolution and long-term legacy of the Australian desert raiding campaign extends far beyond the immediate tactical impacts of World War II into fundamental changes in how military forces understand unconventional warfare, psychological operations, and the cultural dimensions of combat effectiveness. The immediate post-raid period, in late 1941 and 1942, saw the long-range desert group expand and formalize while its methods were adopted by other units, most famously the Special Air Service founded by David Stirling, who explicitly modeled his unit on the Desert Raiders' approach. The validation that small mobile forces could achieve strategic impact through psychological and material disruption became foundational to modern special operations doctrine. The human stories of raiders after the peak campaign period reveal the psychological toll of sustained unconventional operations. Many raiders rotated back to conventional units or returned home as the desert campaign moved into different phases. The transition from autonomous desert operations to conventional military hierarchy was psychologically jarring for men who'd grown accustomed to operating independently. Corporal Ron Hill returned to standard infantry duty in 1942 and found it suffocating. He wrote to a friend that after making life-or-death decisions independently in the desert, taking orders about trivial procedures from officers who'd never faced combat felt absurd. Hill struggled with what we'd now recognize as PTSD, experiencing nightmares about being lost in the desert, hypervigilance that made civilian life difficult, and difficulty connecting with people who hadn't shared his experiences. His story was typical of many raiders who found that the psychological intensity of desert operations had changed them in ways that made normal life feel hollow. The technological legacy of desert raiding influenced military vehicle development for decades. The modifications developed for desert trucks, the navigation equipment designed for featureless terrain, the communications approaches that assumed no infrastructure, all became baseline requirements for special operations vehicles. The British SAS Land Rovers used in later conflicts descended directly from the modified Chevrolets of the Long-Range Desert Group. American Special Operations units studying desert warfare in the 1960s during Vietnam-era unconventional warfare training used long-range desert group operations as case studies. The technological thread from those improvised 1940s truck modifications to modern special operations vehicles is direct and traceable. The psychological and cultural lessons had even broader impact. The recognition that soldiers with cultural values emphasizing initiative and autonomy could achieve disproportionate results influenced post-war military training throughout Western militaries. The emphasis shifted gradually from viewing soldiers as interchangeable components, following orders, to viewing them as adaptive professionals who needed training in judgment and initiative. This cultural shift in military thinking, from hierarchical rigidity to mission-oriented flexibility, traces significantly to the desert raiding example of what properly empowered soldiers could achieve. The Australian cultural identity was shaped by the desert raiders' success in ways still visible today. The narrative of resourceful Australians achieving what British and American forces couldn't, using practical ingenuity rather than overwhelming resources, became part of national mythology. This narrative served important cultural purposes in post-war Australia as the nation continued defining itself as distinct from Britain. The story of desert raiders became classroom material in Australian schools, symbolic proof that Australians could excel through cleverness and adaptability rather than rigid adherence to foreign doctrines. Whether this mythology accurately reflected complex realities is debatable, but its cultural power in shaping Australian military identity is undeniable. The German perspective on desert raiders evolved significantly in post-war years. German veterans writing memoirs often portrayed the desert raiders with respect bordering on admiration, contrasting their competence with what Germans perceived as British tactical rigidity. This retroactive respect served German cultural needs to explain defeat without admitting incompetence, but it also reflected genuine recognition that the raiders had fought in ways Germans couldn't counter. Former Afrika Korps officers in 1960s and 70s interviews often mentioned desert raiders as the most psychologically difficult enemy they'd faced, worse than facing superior numbers or better tanks, because at least those were problems conventional military thinking could address. Fighting an enemy who rewrote warfare's rules created existential confusion that outlasted the war. The long-term psychological impact on survivors has been studied by military psychologists interested in stress resilience. Veterans of desert raiding operations showed interesting patterns. Many struggled with post-war adjustment, experiencing PTSD symptoms decades after events. But they also showed remarkable psychological resilience in the sense that they remained functional during extreme stress. Psychologists concluded that while unconventional operations created unique stresses, the strong unit cohesion, clear mission purpose, and personal autonomy provided protective psychological factors. The worst psychological outcomes appeared in raiders who'd felt their sacrifices were unrecognized or that their unconventional methods were disapproved of by conventional military culture. Recognition and validation of their contribution proved psychologically crucial for healthy adjustment. The broader cultural impact on understanding warfare extended to how societies view military success. The desert raiding campaign demonstrated that technological